The Master of Science in Operations Management program is proud to introduce Dr. Marty Matlock, Professor of Ecological Engineering and Executive Director of the University of Arkansas Resiliency Center. He will be our guest speaker in the continued series of guest lectures in Dr. Ham's Special Topics course, Resilience Design and Crisis Management. All parties have agreed to be recorded.
Welcome everybody to our second series in the guest lecture for your Resilient Design and Crisis Management course. We're very fortunate this evening that we have Dr. Marty Matlock, and Marty is the Executive Director of Resilience Center here at the University of Arkansas. You're going to find, first off, I think you'll realize pretty quickly that Marty is a thought leader in this area, and he's also passionate. So you put the two of those together, and it will make for I think, where we see this convergence of base knowledge and also kind of how we begin to understand a little bit more critical thinking wise. So with all of that said and no further ado, Marty, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you again very much for taking the time to spend time with our students tonight, and we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Oh, thank you, Rich. It's my honor to have this opportunity to work with you guys tonight. I'm looking forward to it. I was able to sneak into the governor's presentation last week, and that was wonderful. And thank you guys for accommodating me with that opportunity. You guys have a unique opportunity to have between the former Secretary of Homeland Security and Rich with his work with Homeland Security. This is not many folks get this kind of access to knowledge, and so it's a great privilege to work with Rich and with this group. Now, the challenge with being both broadly interested and big perspective about things and passionate is that person can be somewhat long-winded. So what I'm going to do is commit to you to move through this presentation fairly quickly, since you have it already and you can refer back to it and you don't have to take notes. You can use that as your own resource. My goal is to use the PowerPoint as a way to keep me on track, not as if I skip over objects in the slides, lots of words and stuff, those words are there for you to review later. They're not there for me to read to you. So that's the way I utilize this technology. So we'll go right to the PowerPoint presentation. It is the vehicle we use, and go to presentation mode down here and off we go. So this is how you find me, mmatlock@uark.edu. I'm an ecological engineer, a bio and agricultural engineer, board certified environmental engineer. My PE is in hydrology. So I'm in the College of Engineering, a faculty member in bio and ag engineering, but I'm also in the Fay Jones School of Architecture and Design because they co-host the Resiliency Center. They're the host of the Resiliency Center with the Walton College of Business and the College of Engineering. You can reach me at mmatlock@uark.edu if you have any questions as we move through. First order of business. Everything is connected. Everything is connected. The ecological domain, the social domain, and the economic domain are nested systems. We often see the sort of sustainability Venn diagram of these three things as people, profit, planet, that sort of thing. That's a nice construct, but it's wrong. These are nested systems. The economic domain does not exist without a social domain. If you don't believe me, take a look at any system where the social domain has been disrupted by natural disaster or social conflict. There is no economic domain. The economic domain goes to the black market. It goes informal. There's always transaction, but the economic domain as an organized and resilient system disappears. The same with the social domain when there's an ecological disruption, natural disaster or man-made disasters like the Great Depression in the 1930s, the social domain unravels. And when the social domain unravels, the economic domain unravels, and so it goes. And when the economic domain unravels, and this is the perhaps the most sinister part of this, is that managing the ecological domain sustainably is the purview of prosperous people. People who are poor do what they have to do to survive. If my family is starving, I will kill the last mountain gorilla to feed them, even though I am an ardent, staunch conservationist. So it's important to understand that these things are nested, but they're also circular. And everything is changing, and that rate of change is faster than anything we've experienced in our lives. It is an amazing process. And we'll talk about that a minute later. Normative proclamation, we're all in this together. All 7.3 billion of our brothers and sisters on the planet are in this together. What are we trying to, what are we trying to make resilient? What are we trying to sustain? The 17 Sustainable Development Goals developed by the United Nations, partnerships of all the organized 170 plus nations of the world to define the things that matter most to us, 16 explicit outcomes and the 17th goal is a partnership to achieve those 16 goals. The challenge is those 16 goals, while they're not controversial, clean water and sanitation, life on land and life below water, those are not controversial issues, but they are in tension. Ain't nothing free in this world. So if you need to provide clean water and sanitation for people, that's going to require energy, which means sometimes digging up stuff out of the ground and burning it to produce energy to create clean water and sanitation, which means climate action, which means we are sacrificing greenhouse gas emissions in order to provide those. Now you think that's an over there problem. And I talk a lot about over there versus here problems because there is this first world, third world false notion in our thinking. And what I want to do is disavow you of that. There is no first world, third world. There is just a world that we live in. In Northwest Arkansas, where we currently reside, I'm coming to you from my parlor in Fayetteville, Arkansas, thanks to COVID. One of the largest consumers of energy in our region is the Beaver Water District water treatment plant. One of the second largest consumers of energy in our region are the wastewater treatment plants. So those two things are burning coal to give us clean water. So there's a tension in everything. We have to make trade-offs. The problem we have is that certain impacts are uncontroversial from a scientific perspective. They may be controversial from a socio-political perspective, but that's just gaming. From a scientific perspective, it's getting hot out there. From a scientific perspective, it's changing. And that change is happening at an increasing rate. And it's seen all over the planet. It's a global impact. And the consequences of it are going to be felt in our cities, among other places. We have a common goal, prosperity. That is the thing we are trying to achieve. We're not trying to make the world better for the warm and fluffy mammals that we're trying to preserve, or they're charismatic megafauna, so everyone loves elephants. Nobody particularly cares so much about the ground snake, but they're all good, amazing creatures, right? They're all God's creatures. But what we are trying to sustain is prosperity for humanity. Prosperity is the goal, human prosperity. 7.3 billion of us on the planet now, probably 12 billion by 2050, maybe 10 billion. We've got 2 to 2.5 billion or more people coming to dinner, and they're not going to come from around here. As part of that, getting rid of this us and them, this first world, third world notion. We are all one world, and this world is expanding. And the 2.5 billion people who are going to come to dinner in the next 40 years, heck, the next 30 years now, are going to come from less developed economies. And that's a challenge for a number of reasons. So at this point, we are living in a world where a good portion of the population today, a little over 50%, lives in urban areas. It's going to go to 68% by 2050. 68% in 30 years of humanity will live in urban areas. Urbanization, the gradual shift in residence from human population from rural to urban areas, that's urbanization, combined with the overall growth of the world population of people in cities have babies too, will add 2.5 billion people to the urban areas by 2050. 90% of this increase taking place in Asia and Africa. I try to provide the citations for all of my slides at the bottom, so you can go find them, either as web links or as journal citations. Let's talk about cities. 1970. Now we have two different types of information being projected on these graphs. One is the color of the country, and the second is the size of the city. The cities are circles. The color of the country, of course, is just shaded. So the color of the country goes from sort of brown to, which is highly urban, 80 to 100% urban. And notice in 1970, only Australia was urban. Actually, it looks like that would be Finland. No, it would be Sweden was urban too, because Stockholm. So those two were the urban cities or countries on the planet in 1970. Everything else was 60 to 80% urban or less. And we had quite a few, and we had a lot of blues, a lot of things that we didn't have data on yet Realize 1970 is not that long ago. Dr. Ham and I remember 1970 pretty well. And we still had a lot of lack of information, especially in China and India and in Southeast Asia. But look at how many megacities we had on the planet then. 1970, how many megacities did we have? We had, let's see if I can, Rich, I assume that my little bar from the is not showing to everybody. You can see my slides without the bar.
I can see the slides. I don't see the bar.
Okay, good. That's just want to make sure, because the little mute and unmute bar is right in the middle of my screen right now. So I want to make sure you guys weren't seeing that. All right. So you see that we had two mega cities in Japan and New York City, 1970, over 10 million people. That was it. Now, China probably had a mega city. We just didn't know about it in 1970. Richard Nixon didn't go to China until 71, I believe, maybe 72. Mm-hmm. So it was still a closed system to us. 1990, just 20 years later, look at the number of megacities, and more importantly, look at the number of cities. 1 million to 5 million is a city. Anything less than that's probably a town. Northwest Arkansas metropolitan region is a little over 500,000. To give you a sense, so twice that area gives us a city. So we suddenly have Los Angeles is a mega city now. Chicago is a city, but not a mega city. Mexico City is a mega city. We have 2 mega cities in the United States at this time, and a half dozen around the world, and a lot of big cities, 5 to 10 million around the world. More importantly, look at urbanization is shifting, how a lot of cities have gone from yellow to tan. Now, a lot of those that we had no data on, we have data, and we see that they were 20 to 40% urban. I would just say they were still predominantly rural. 2018, effectively today, all of the Western Hemisphere is effectively urban. A few countries are still suburban, but most are urban. Look at the number of cities that expanded, blue dots, and look at the number of mega cities that have expanded. Now, what's going to happen in the next 20 years, 2030? This is our challenge. Cities are our challenge. Cities are the condition of the human species now and in the future. It's not about the rural landscape. It's not about subsistence agriculture. Those are all anachronistic views of human experience. They are as the sort of subsistence agricultural producer is almost as anachronistic as the hunter-gatherer. What is a city? It's a human ecosystem. It's a human ecosystem that includes a social system, a resource system, and an ecosystem supporting it, just like that nested set. So the human system, social system is complex. It has diversity of values. The resource systems are cultural and socioeconomic. Cultural resources are among the most underappreciated in terms of importance. Organizations' beliefs and myths define behaviors and values. They define values, which define behaviors. Socioeconomic resources are the consequence of those values and behaviors. If you want to change behaviors, you have to change understanding and values. And that is incredibly hard to do because beliefs are generational, multi-generational. All of these are dependent upon ecosystem structures and processes, which are being depleted and changing. And our ability to change our organization's beliefs and myths is very slow. We are not good at it, and it takes a long time. And yet the changes that we're experiencing in the infrastructures that demand that and the socioeconomic resources is happening very fast. And so you wonder why we have conflict? This is it. Biological systems change under very predictable patterns. There are a number of ways that you can predict change. If you're a brewer of yeast or a baker of bread, you understand that a brewer of beer and baker of bread, you understand that yeast grows exponentially when you mix it with a little warm water and sugar. Off it goes. That exponential growth is one form of growth where it just keeps multiplying and multiplying. And if and some economists think this is the way your 401k is going to grow. And if they do, find another investor. Goal seeking is another form where you have some sort of threshold, a carrying capacity. And so the system actually adjusts with feedbacks, and feed forward will actually adjust to the goal. Oftentimes you get an oscillation in a system, and oscillation is up and down about usually some feedback system, like some carrying capacity. So for example, if you have a carrying capacity in a system, you'll have exponential growth until it exceeds the carrying capacity. And if there's feedback in reproduction rates, for example, then the feedback rate will cause an oscillation about that carrying capacity. And if the feedback is really well tuned, you can get an S-shaped growth curve where you never exceed the capacity of the system to support to be supported based upon the resources. More commonly, what happens is the feedback systems don't work very well, and so you overshoot and then collapse. From a species perspective, that's extinction. From a city perspective, that's failure. These are also ways that we respond to disruptions. So let's take a look at what's happening around our world. So we've had, this is from the Great Acceleration, Stefan et al. From 2011, greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, ammonia, nitrogen, CO2, methane, climate impacts as a result of that. Look at the curves. Ocean impacts, look at the curves. Terrestrial impacts, look at the curves. Drivers of these systems, economic growth, GDP, people population, water resources and agricultural development, prosperity consumption. Look at the numbers of McDonald's restaurants from 1950 to 2000, and that's tabled off a little bit. Perhaps there's some goal seeking at the top. Perhaps there's some carrying capacity. And global connectivity, transportation, communications, and tourism, travel. It's amazing. Well, what does this look like from a resiliency perspective? Resiliency is the ability to withstand being knocked around and then the ability to get back up when you've been knocked down from an individual perspective or systems perspective. And our cities are just systems, human ecosystems. So resiliency is measured both in terms of time and reaction. So it takes the time of recovery from some disruption event and the extent of recovery over that period of time are two measures of the resiliency of a system. Now, when we say build it back better, as we hear some of our political candidates saying in this season, what they're saying is that the resilient system, after being knocked down with COVID, our economy being knocked down, it will come back to above where it was, say in February of 2020. And so those are the sorts of concepts that they're very core to this notion of resiliency. So as we talk about cities, again, what we have is a tension between these cities because they're dynamic meta systems. They're systems of systems. Cities are neighborhoods. Cities are economic production systems. They're manufacturing. They're transactions and exchange. They're wastewater and water infrastructure, electricity. All those elements are systems, and they're all linked together in this meta system. So you could diagram all of these as sort of circles and arrows and boxes, and you can see how complex the city gets very quickly. Here's the thing that makes them resilient. It's the ability of these linkages have to have these sort of opposite characteristics. They need to be redundant and efficient, diverse and interdependent, strong and flexible, autonomous and collaborative. You have to have planning and adaptability. So this is all from Gottschalk of 2003. So it's a 17-year-old concept. This is not new, this understanding, but we're still not very good at mapping and documenting and improving these processes. Where we live is fragile. It's fragile for 100 reasons or more, but it's fragile. So we're used to seeing these pictures from over there. This is Ecuador, the city in Ecuador from an earthquake in 2014. It's not I mean, we're almost numb to these sorts of images of this sort of destruction. People died, lives were disrupted, property was lost, and economic transactions were delayed or destroyed. And building back is ongoing. We don't see these things just over there. They're global. San Francisco earthquake, the amount of damage to infrastructure, the lives lost. And we've had 3 major earthquakes in my lifetime in the Bay Area. This is not a novel phenomenon to us. If we were in a classroom, I'd ask you what this is, and most of you would say, oh, well, it looks like some sort of a warfare zone, right? No, this is Oregon this year. This is a neighborhood in Oregon, a prosperous neighborhood, a wealthy neighborhood in Oregon this year. Lives were lost, property destroyed. Moore, Oklahoma. I grew up in Oklahoma, 8th generation Okie on the Cherokee side. I can tell you that we grew up with the myth of the F5 tornado. We never really thought we'd ever see one. Lots of folks said, we kind of, in Oklahoma, you live in this sort of meteorology sort of subcult where our meteorologists are the superstars of our newscasts. So Gary England was the superstar. If you watch Twister, Gary England was on Twister too. He was our superstar meteorologist, and he's the one who told people when this first F5 tornado was coming to Moore, Oklahoma, get underground. You will not survive this. This is an F5 tornado. You will not survive it if you're above ground. That's the sort of thing. This city, south of Oklahoma City, has been hit twice by F5 tornadoes in 20 years. And the number of F5 tornadoes on record prior to that were questionable, because to determine the strength prior to that, you basically had to go out and look at the damage, and none had hit an urban area. And so, when you see plumbing pulled up out of concrete slabs, it was an F5 tornado. When you see blacktop ripped off out of the ground, it was an F5 tornado. That's the sort of thing they look at. Rich, I know you've had this sort of experience. It's dramatic. It's catastrophic. Having been a first responder to those systems, it's terrifying, because you don't know what you're going to find, or more critically, who you're going to find in that wreckage. Hurricanes. Hurricane Zeta will hit New Orleans sometime around 8 o'clock tonight. This is October, 28th, 2020. Hurricane Zeta will hit New Orleans at a Category 2 storm, the 5th hurricane to hit New Orleans this year. Hurricanes aren't just about the wind damage or the tidal surge. Really, it's about the flooding. This is Hurricane Harvey. I'm a hydrologist. The record flooding from Harvey up and down the Texas coast in Louisiana and inland, far inland, was staggering. And so we think, okay, that's only going to happen once. Well, it will probably happen again in the next 5 years. Here's our big challenge. Building this capacity, this mitigation capacity, involved for of multiple involved communities, means anticipating and responding to disasters. The most vulnerable people to disasters are the poor. The challenge we have, the challenge with the poor is they don't have access to coping resources. They can't go somewhere else because they got nowhere else to go or no way to get there. And once they get there, they got nothing. They got no way to sustain themselves once they're there. And they're leaving sometimes everything they've worked their entire lives behind to do that. So natural disasters, I want to suggest to you, are a social phenomena. They're not a natural phenomena, because what makes a disaster isn't the event, it's the people affected by the event. To reduce vulnerability requires expanding understanding the way societies unevenly allocate their environmental risk and social and political commitments to promote greater economic equality, equity, and environmental justice. The poorest and most vulnerable communities within a city are the weakest link in its mitigation capacity. Poverty, prosperity, those two things are fully connected in our ability to be resilient. Let's just take a small sort of narrative here, the sort of life of a person. Let's say a life of a woman in Indonesia. Her husband dies. That's their main source of income. So she's impoverished because of that. Or there's bank erosion, which causes the loss of a home. And so now there's homelessness. Or as we just get older, and guess what? You have two choices in this world. You get older or you die. So getting older means reduced ability to work. And that can mean even something as sustaining as collecting drinking water. Deterioration in health due to drinking water, of saline water, if you're especially in a place like Indonesia, where you have infusion into your groundwater. Higher levels of salinity, which cause decreased health. Or a cyclone or some other external event which causes the loss of livestock or loss of jobs. Increased levels of food insecurity. This is the cycle that results in impoverishment and human impacts from from disruption. It's not over there. This is an elderly couple from Mayflower, Arkansas, whose home was hit with a tornado. This is here. This is us. So there are 8 basic elements of resilient systems, 8 basic elements which give us a way to think about these. If you're going to make a city resilient, you need a redundancy. Number of functional similar components so the entire system doesn't fail at once. Diversity, number of functionally different components in order to protect the system. Don't stack them all in one place. Don't put all your emergency response equipment, communications, and personnel in one building. Efficiency, a positive ratio of energy supplied to energy delivered by dynamic system. Efficiency matters. Again, these are intention, because efficiency demands hierarchical coalescing, that is stacking it all together. But the problem with that is it violates the redundancy requirement. These are intention. Autonomous, the capability to operate independently outside of control. One of the most frustrating things to be to arrive on any sort of scene of a disaster is to see people standing around doing nothing because they don't know what to do. Just basic civil defense training is gone from our society. Just not even knowing what you're supposed to do and not even having the structure, knowledge to do that. Strength, the power to resist attack or resist outside impact. That is to stay standing in the face of the pressures. Now, in urban systems, that's often through building codes or other design criteria, flood control designs. Interdependence, system components connected so they support each other. Adaptability, the capacity to learn from experience and flexibility to change. And most importantly, collaborative cultures, multiple opportunities, incentives for stakeholder participation and engagement. D'Souza and Flannery identified these strategies for creating this sustainability, because those criteria I described to you, they're 20 years old. This is not new. This is part of our sort of systems knowledge of how to make things better. So what they said, if you want to achieve some of these things like buffering, redundancy, you need to assume change and uncertainty as a reality. So if the managers know this is going to happen, then that means you're going to actually learn from crisis. You're going to do adaptive planning, strategic foresights. You're going to engage. You want to nurture conditions for recovery and renewal after the disturbance. It's going to be disturbed. It's going to happen. So how do you create the social connections so that you have social capital so that people engage afterwards? And then social ecological memory, so you know what to make it back to, what you lost and how to recover it. And ecological diversity. Combine different types of knowledge for learning, because there are many ways of knowing. So hypothetical reductionism is great for designing sewer systems and electrical power plants. It's not great for designing places for people to interact and dynamic places for people to experience the wonders of life. Create opportunities for self-organization, multi-scale networks and connectivity, interplay between diversity and disturbance. I think this is probably, self-organization is probably the thing that's missing most in our communities. So D'Souza and Flannery gave us this sort of graphic to help us, and we'll run through this real quick. We have resources, processes that give us the physical environment. People, institutions, and activity give us the social environment. People and activities and institutions are the gears turning, interacting with physical systems, the processes and the resources, and that supports the social dynamics. And that's the way the system works. That's a city. Well, when you have stressors in the city, natural, economic, technological, or human stressors that are coming in, you can result in destruction, decline, and disruption. Those are the bad things you don't want to happen. How do you avoid those bad things? Well, you can have two responses. You can suppress the bad things, or you can enhance the bad things to result in an impact that is positive or negative. Believe it or not, in many cases, cities do things, but through their decision-making, that make the things worse, that take the bad things and make them worse, that take a disruption and turn it into a destruction event. You can look at the economic impacts of Detroit. You can look at the, geez, we're living through one of these right now. It's just hard. So understanding these connections is key. So what do you need? You need planning for flexibility so that you don't make things worse. You need design for adaptability so that you can make things better. And then you need management. You need the agility so that when the event happens, you can actually manage it with knowledge, communicate it, and have the right people making decisions. Now, I got a lot of words in these next slides because I think it's important that you have these words, but I'm not going to read these to you, but I'm going to go through them at a high level. So if you want to mitigate communities' impacts, the increasing the capacity of community mitigation requires social and institutional resilience. To achieve the goal of a resilient city, urban hazard practices must include technical and social approaches. It is a social problem. It's not just a technical problem, getting the lights back on and the toilets flushing and the water running. Those are social problems too. You have to monitor vulnerability reduction. You have to measure this stuff to see if you're actually making it better. You have to build distributed hazard mitigation capacity around your community so it's not centralized, so that you have appropriate malleability and responses to local community needs. You have to develop broad hazard mitigation commitments. That means people who are making decisions need to be trained, understand the process, and ready to act. After the event, during the event, it's too late to train. It's too late to plan. You have to have networked communications. Now, that's a whole lot easier these days with cell phones. What happens when the cell networks go out? Now, one of the things we know in Arkansas, because we're in rural areas, is that texting will ultimately get through, even if you can't connect the calls. Even if you got one bar intermittently, you put a text together, and eventually, if you get a bar, it'll get through. Simple things like that. Adopt recognized equity standards. But so for community, by the way, back to number 5, for community, that means you need to be able to stand up portable cell towers quickly so you can find people who are in distress, so you can identify where your hazards are and your opportunities are. Adopt recognized equity standards to ensure that you don't just save the wealthy, that you don't just clear the snow off the streets and the ice off the streets of the wealthy communities. Assist vulnerable neighborhoods and populations, and mitigate business interruptions from impacts, because business matters, folks. Transactions matter. You got to have food. You got to have energy. These businesses matter. Now, the Rockefeller Foundation initiated its 100 Resilient Cities about 5 years ago. So they developed a framework. This framework has 4 big categories: leadership and strategy, health and well-being, economy and society, infrastructure and ecosystems. And they gave money to 100 cities around the world to hire resiliency officers and to put them in place and to try to make these cities more resilient. And so the structure of this was you have 4 categories, 12 goals, 52 indicators, and 156 variables. This is death by metrics. So their notion was that every city would try to move the ball with these things. So they tried to create one set of indicators to rule them all. Now, it's a pretty darn good effort. Let me tell you, they had good effort. Lots of people put a lot of time and effort in here. So you have this as a reading. I encourage you to jump in. They understand that cities are reflective, that resilient cities have reflective systems where they understand things are changing. That's the recognition. Robust systems include well-conceived, constructed, and managed physical assets. Redundant systems, we talked about it a number of times, where you don't have all the, you don't put your generators that operate the cooling systems for your nuclear power plant in the basement where it's going to flood. That's the Fukushima challenge. You just don't do that. You have redundancy, and you also have some sense of hazard. Flexibility, the system has to be able to change and evolve as the needs do. Resourcefulness, you got to figure out how to get the stuff where it needs to be, when it needs to be, and in the way it needs to be. Think about Puerto Rico after Maria. Just getting drinking water to people was just woefully inadequate. Inclusive, and I can't say this enough, inclusiveness determines the legitimacy of the enterprise, because after this is done, folks are going to live together or they're not going to live together. And people remember forever. And integrated alignment between city systems promotes consistency in decision-making and ensures all investments are mutually supportive to a common outcome. I'm wrapping up here, but components of vulnerability and their determinants from communities, these are the things that make places fragile. So if you have initial well-being, things that make you good, that make a community healthy or prosperous include nutrition, physical and mental health, morale, faith, capacity for self-reliance. So there are things that determine that: social position, gender, ethnicity, age, state and civil society, livelihood resilience, self-protection, societal protection, social capital. This looks very Maslow-ish, right? Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it's true. Understanding these is important because failure happens fast, and failure rolls through communities fast. When things go bad, they go bad fast. Disaster impacts have ecological, humanitarian, economic costs. Those economic costs are direct, loss of capital stock, indirect, and macroeconomics. Folks, take a look at the cost of economic losses from natural catastrophes in the 20th century. And this is 20 years old. That line, that dotted line, the trend of economic losses, which is at 70 billion in 2000 has continued to go up to about 110 billion now. And I will end with this. And this is the most poignant of my points. Poverty is the most insidious driver of human fragility. We are trying to protect and maintain human prosperity. When these systems fail, people die. Kevin Carter took this picture of this child in Sudan in 1993 with his vulture looking over her shoulder. This little girl, her mother had set her down because she couldn't carry her anymore. They were 400 meters from an aid station. He took this picture just before he picked her up and carried her to the aid station. Kevin Carter tragically took his own life the next year. He won the Pulitzer Prize for this photograph. This is human, folks. This is caused by drought. This is the Sudan. It was a drought of record in the region, which caused famine, which caused refugees, resulted in refugees moving to places where there was food, which resulted in social conflict, which resulted in genocide, which resulted in civil war, which resulted in disruption of crop production, which resulted in famine. And so it goes. So with that, I'll be happy to take questions and address any concerns or questions you have.
Okay, everybody should be able to unmute themselves and ask a question.
Blake, thank you for your comment.
While they're, as they're doing it, and some of them, you know, I'm sure will have some things that they'll mention. Marty, one of the things that's interesting, we don't hear a lot, and this is a great idea about how they will make these applications for things. When they're designing resilience, understanding a shift towards urbanization is important, because what we've lost is one of we had depended on forever, this primary idea of diversification as being a mitigation strategy for resilience. If people live a long way apart, then when the tornado comes through, you don't have the same. And so it's that way for all systems, that it actually, just like you said, cities amplify all the problems and they reduce our ability to mitigate it. If you're looking at things now, in your opinion, things like, with that in mind, energy production, the use of energy and where we are, regardless of political debate, but just some resilient ideas of things that we should look at. And then if we're planning for those, whether I'm in a business or government or however, what are the kind of things that, you know, we should give some consideration to about how to make that work?
You know, I think the first step is understanding your system, understanding what you're dependent upon, what the critical resources are that upon which you depend, and then what your processes are. Well, let's start with something as simple as peanut M&Ms, and a fairly glib example, because after that little girl from Sudan, I need glib, because that's a bit of a heart-wrenching way to end. I did that on purpose because I want you guys to understand we are saving lives with what we're proposing to do. This is about life and death. Now let's step away to the yellow M&M, a little less life and death. Mars Corporation in the 1990s was struggling because they couldn't source Spanish peanuts for their M&Ms. They had to have a couple of criteria for Spanish peanuts. They had to be grown in the U.S. because they weren't going to source them from China because they didn't trust them. So they had to be U.S. grown. They had to be a certain size. They had to not break open. When you take the little skin off of them, they had to not break open, because when they break open, you can't chocolate coat them. They couldn't source them. They were running out. There was a period in the late 90s where you could not buy peanut M&Ms because they stopped making them, because they couldn't source this thing that they needed. And the reason is they were dependent upon a U.S. commoditized supply chain, and they just assumed that someone would grow them and they'd go buy them. Well, what they realized is the farmers are getting old and quit growing them. The farmers that had grown them before just quit growing them because they can make better money doing something else. And so suddenly they lost their supply. Now, if you're in the business of putting yellow M&Ms on the shelf for consumers, you go out of business very quickly if you can't get the peanuts to do that. Another example is long grain white rice. It's Halloween coming up. Everybody loves Crispy Puffs candy, right? The little Rice Krispie bars. Everybody loves those. You couldn't, I think it's Kellogg, could not find enough long grain rice in the early 2000s to put Rice Krispies on the shelf to make their product because their supply chain was broken. Now, those are just glib examples of not knowing where your supply chain is and depending on the black box to solve your problem. If you're a municipality and you depend on SWEPCO to be your energy supplier, like Fayetteville, and we're part of the Southwestern Power Pool energy grid, and we think everything's going to fine. Oklahoma has an ice storm. They have lots of power outages and they have rolling blackouts because of power outages that can roll back to us. And if we don't understand that we're in the Southwest Power Pool and we don't understand that our power comes from that system, and when it goes down, or if it's all dependent upon coal and the price of coal goes up or the regulations of coal go up, then our price goes up. Then we are subject to unknown forces. There's a lot of uncertainty in the world, and most of that uncertainty is not manageable. If you're not manageable, the things you can't, if you're not managing the things you can manage because you're ignorant of them, that's just incompetence. And so that's the key. So my message is understand everything about the system that you're managing that you can. Those things you can't control, you just can't control. You have to understand their hazards, the sort of either probability distributions or randomness or consequences of those. But if you know that, if you could know something and don't know it, that's on you. And unfortunately, that seems to be the case for businesses, municipalities, because we're all in sort of this entropic rut of doing the things the way we've always done them. Well, the problem with doing the things the way we've always done them when everything is changing is they don't work anymore. And so that's the key. Understand what's changing, how it's changing, why it's changing, and if you have any control over the responses to those changes. And if you do, then implement them. So municipalities starting to put in their own, like Fayetteville, putting in its own solar grid as a way to sort of hedge against higher energy prices in the future. That's a perfect example of controlling what you can.
Yeah, so I'm going to give an opportunity for people. That gets exactly to the point that I was exactly. And there's some emerging discussion about individual resilience that kind of was I think it accidentally happened 100 years ago, but as a kid, I can give you a good example here. I grew up not that far from here, left for 40 years, but there were a lot of Class C dairy farms in Southwest Missouri, Northwest Arkansas, and had a horrible, ice storm that took out the power for 2 to 3 weeks or more for some of these, but they had to milk the cows. And those farmers on their own had developed this little plan to where they hired people that had motorhomes that would pull up and hook up so they could milk the cows every day. So, I mean, and nobody talked to them about that. I mean, I think most of maybe not for people in the class, because some of them, when I say grandfather, that's almost me, but my grandfather, certainly that generation and the ones before, they had this individualized resilience plan. Can you talk a little bit about that, about what's emerging in that space?
Certainly, and that's that you see that language emerging with this individualism, this sort of rugged interdependence and self-dependent reliance. This notion that we have to be both codependent and self-reliant is key. So that means that we cannot, as an individual, as a family unit. And of course, there are no such thing as individual humans. Let's make that clear. The human entity is a family. And that family is broadly defined as, 2 or more people, basically. But it's a family because a human that's just a single individual operating without interconnection with anyone else is a sociopath or an outcast or a castaway. That's not the human condition. So the human condition is a social unit called a family, some form or another. The family has to be resilient itself. That's where it begins. How do you make families resilient? Socioeconomic resiliency, property, assets, access to resources. It's really about access to resources. There are a number of ways to access resources. Money is one of the big ways to access resources. If you are 19th century South Dakotan, when the blizzard hits and you can't get off the farm, you've got a family unit of 7 or 8 people in the house. You have the resources to stay alive because you plan for that. That's the sort of frontier resilience that has become very much part of the American myth. It is a myth, but it's still it's a good one, right? It's part of our self-reliance. But how do we do this in urban areas when you're poor? What you have is social capital. And what you have is knowledge power. What you have is relationships. And those relationships are how our urban communities, impoverished urban communities, survive during disruptions, because people know each other and have trust relationships and transactional relationships. In some cases, I did things for you, you'll do things for me, but that almost is always building trust and sort of a collegiality. Social capital, all of those. So the building of social capital is the metric for that. So social capital can be purchased. If you have enough gold, you have friends. So it can be purchased. But most people, I mean, as we've discussed, really the people who are most affected by most of these natural disasters are the people who live in the vulnerable areas, because that's where the cheap land is, and they don't have the resources to escape from it. And because we have become so polarized as a society, we've become so I hate to use this word, but we have become so segregated as a society. We are sorted out, mostly by economics, but also by ethnicity, culture, and race. We are sorted out. Because of that sorting, we do not have a lot of mobility across those groups. And that is a major source of fragility in our communities. It is getting worse. And that is a source of harm, damage, and destruction. It's happening with social disruption, because let me tell you, these disasters that hit our cities are not all natural. Sometimes they're human disasters, riots. And so that sort of violence or just social disruption, and that can happen through crime, through gang activities, etc. All of those are the product of this unraveling of this sorting and segregation. That's why we have this is all interconnected. We have to reconnect our communities and our community members together in a way that I'm not talking about some grand utopia. I don't believe in that. But I do believe that there has to be that we have to intentionally create the opportunities for our children to know each other. And so that as adults, they know each other. And so we have to create the opportunities for our sectors of our community to engage with each other, blue and red, Catholic and Jewish and Muslim, and whatever the categories are by which we sort ourselves. And it's almost all economic, by the way. We have to unsort them. I grew up in Oklahoma, poor, Native American, in an African American community in North Tulsa. I was sorted by economy. And it was the best thing that could have happened to me as a kid, to grow up in a polycultural environment where everybody was poor, because we were all at the same economic level. We shared things. We got to know each other. We learned each other's cultures. We respected each other. There were conflicts, there were fights, just like there are with any group of kids, but it was an incredibly robust place to be. Not utopic by any means. And certainly some of my cousins and friends, brothers and sisters through that environment, culture got the best of them. Many of them died from gang violence and other violence in Tulsa as they got older. But that's the way we have to do this. So Rich, I know I'm going off on this this big social thing, but I think this is a core. You mentioned this earlier, the challenge we have. Cities are human ecosystems. How do we want to live together? Do we want to live in some big ice train where we're sorted based upon economics, and is that the way we expect to live, in some hierarchical sort of tooth and claw world where people do not care for each other? That's not a world I aspire to. That's a world I will work to dismantle.
Well, I think that's exactly, and students, as we discussed back and forth on some of these at any time, certainly engage as you have something sparks a question with you. But what, Marty, I think what you expressed, so as the students are looking at ways to mitigate this, so urbanization has made some of that more difficult. In fact, the pandemic's a good example, right? An urban environment is the place to spread a pandemic. You can't go, work your land and not engage anybody, and it just kind of over time it kind of phases out over many years, or there's a vaccine before. I mean, that's not an opportunity. So these close quarters, that means higher need for energy consumption. It means a higher need for transportation to get to work through very difficult environments. So it's amplified all this need. So when we look at how we design and plan systems, the consideration, and I think is what you brought up today is really great, is the students work towards a group project at the end where they're looking at, how do I take all these things I learned from EMI courses and from the text and try to put this together with how would I create mitigation? So do you know any kind of successes or case studies you could point to and say, hey, here's a place that recognized it and started trying to do something about it, or at least some efforts, any place that have attempted?
There are examples of cities that have come back. And what you see are sort of moments of success and periods of success. Portland, Oregon is probably the best example of a city that in the 80s was just a derelict port city, and then reinvented itself through urban planning, urban design, an intentional vision of success, reinvented itself as a city of sustainable quality of life for everyone. Now they're still struggling, and so they've had a 40-year run that's been quite successful. Not done yet, and the conflict they're having, the fact that Portland is where we're seeing sort of this I would consider the high level of social conflict over historic race, ethnic inequalities, and it's happening there. That means they have the social capital to have that conversation in their city without fear, even to the point of backing away and letting some sort of some neighborhoods do weird things as long as no one gets hurt. They have that confidence. So Portland's an example. That's an interesting example, and they've made some mistakes too. But boy, I know I was in Portland in '84, and I was afraid to walk the streets at night. It was a dangerous city in '84. It is not now. Now it's an ideal place. I'm going to ask Paul to chime in here in a minute. I'm sorry, Blake to chime in here in a minute, because Tulsa, where I grew up, is an example of a city that's trying. Tulsa's the 1921 race riots have been. It's not a riot. It wasn't a riot. It was the racial attacks that occurred in 1921 have become part of our popular culture over the last 2 years. I grew up learning about them. I learned about them in the 90s. They were kind of held. They were swept away in Tulsa history until they came back in the 90s. But I went to the first integrated public school in Tulsa in 1968. Tulsa worked very aggressively through the 60s and 70s and 80s to try to recover from its history, from its evil past. Evil is the only way you can characterize the racism that defined it in the past, and to try to create a prosperous community. And then what happened is they were doing great guns. They were quite successful, telecommunications and aerospace. And then the aerospace industry collapsed and telecommunications industry collapsed. And now they're in major disarray. What are they doing now? They're working very aggressively now to recreate themselves as an eco-city. And that concept is they're grabbing a hold of a collective vision for what they want to be next. They're not wallowing in what they were. They recognize that's not coming back. And I'm going to brag on Blake's granddad, Paul, I grew up in Tulsa. The Riverwalk was one of the most amazing public assets around the Arkansas River that turned the Arkansas River from a sewer, because people were on it, they had to clean the water up then, from a sewer into a public asset. And then apartments went up and all sorts of high value. It became a destination. And they've expanded on that fivefold with public parks, public investment. Now it's a major core attraction in the city. And it's the Riverwalk of San Antonio effectively in Tulsa now. And that came from intentional collective vision and design through this process of collaborative decision-making and willful decision-making. Blake, I've talked about your granddad. Do you want to talk about him?
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
Okay. I was simply talking with Dr. Matlock about my grandfather, who was the first director of the Tulsa Urban Renewal Authority. He joined in, I believe, the early 60s and was previously an urban manager for Magnolia, Arkansas, of sorts. But anyway, got his BA from the U of A in architecture. Didn't practice architecture a day in his life. But anyway, he moved to Tulsa along with my dad and aunt and grandmother. And change is hard. Change is very hard. And when they first moved in, he got death threats. People would dump abandoned vehicles in front of their yard. The next mayor threatened to fire him. And it was very difficult, but he was able to get some people on his crew that were visionaries and were not afraid of change, and came up with ideas for the Riverwalk, where at that time there were people living on the Riverwalk with mud floors in their houses. And
yes,
with the HUD,
that's usually where the African American community was located, and the emerging Hispanic community.
right.
That's where the poor folks lived.
But even from that own community, there was a lot of pushback, even though he was able to get them into much better housing without mud floors, with indoor sanitation. He was able to improve the quality of life for a lot of people. And I love driving through Tulsa and looking at things that he was involved in and improve quality of life, not just immediately, but over the next 50, 60 years.
And the way he did that was to build a coalition. Again, he
Right.
built a coalition with the African American community and the other minority communities, Native American communities, to implement this program. Native Americans were very weak at that time. We didn't have casinos yet. We're not so weak now, by God. But at the time we were. And so, but he built those coalitions, and he created this sense of trust that it wasn't just a taking. It wasn't just another form of gentrification to boot people out, the poor people out of this place, because it gave them value for their land, value for their resources, and allowed relocation in a way that had dignity. Didn't force people into a camp, gave people the resources to select for themselves. And I was in Tulsa growing up as a kid when that was happening. And so that was part of my sort of water I was swimming in. And it was an incredibly powerful experience to understand how communities work together to make things better together, and to sort of, and go about creating a vision of the next. And so, Rich, I think the key is there has to be a vision of the next. If you can't visualize something better, you're going to live in your own pig squalor the rest of your lives. And, you know, as European descendants, and many of us are, not all of us, but as those of us of European descent, it wasn't too many generations ago when the pigs were part of your living room furniture. So don't get all high and mighty about our other cousins who are around the planet who are still living with their livestock. It's the best way to protect them from your neighbors. But my point is, this is hard. This thing we're doing together, recreating our cities as ecosystems that function for everybody. The key is, if they don't function for everybody, it's just a matter of time before the others come and get you. If you create others, what you're creating are those that are going to come and get you. The key is not to create others, to create us. And this is not some big utopian notion. This is just simple Machiavellian concepts about power. You do not exploit power over people who will have power over you. There's another way to say it. Don't look down as a nice euphemism. Don't look down on people today who you'll be looking up to tomorrow. I mean, we're all connected, and this process is turning fast. So we have to create our cities in a way that do this. A city that's trying to do this right now, southeastern Arkansas. God, I'm suddenly I'm blanking on the name. Southeast of Little Rock. Help me out.
Well, you could be Pine Bluff's a little south.
Pine Bluff. So Pine Bluff is trying to do this right now. They're going through an urban management. Thanks, Blake, for your comments and your support there. So Pine Bluff is doing this now. I'm going to Eureka Springs tomorrow to sit out around a fire in the cold with 15 leaders of Eureka Springs to talk about how to make Eureka Springs and how to design an eco-city around Eureka Springs, how to take them from where they are to where they need to be next. You know what? The first goal is going to have to be affordable housing. You have to have 30% of housing available to the 30% of people who make, to the people at 30% of the bottom of the economy. That's just rational. If you've got an economy, an economic distribution of people from low to high, or from your perspective, from high to low, you better have housing that accommodates everybody, or you got homelessness. It's that simple. And so we have to figure out a way to do this in a way that is rational. The notion that the market will adjust for this is nonsense. We have to get past our fetish of open markets, of the free market system to solve social problems. It never has. It never will. The free market system is good for efficient transactions of transfer of goods and services. We're not talking about transfers of goods and services, and we should not commoditize human values and human life. Those are not goods and services. Those are human values. Those are human lives. That little girl in Sudan is not a commodity.
So it's an interesting, and that photo, I remember when it came out, and the reason for me is because I've actually been to much of Africa and other parts of the world where you could see this firsthand. Things on the Ivory Coast, Ghana, Senegal, a lot of time that I've spent there, plus sub-Saharan Africa. And so some of these things, I think it doesn't really come home to folks because they've not really seen it or, understood what the impact was, whether it was civil war or famine or drought, and what the long-term impact. It's not something that, you have a 5-year drought. The 5-year drought has a 30-year effect. So
Yeah.
the understanding of the recovery phase, which brings us long-term part. So one of the things last week after the governor that we talked about were kind of these cycles in resilience. When we look how we plan and we kind of have normal operations, we plan, we exercise, we look at what we can do. And then we hit this emergency phase. And then after we figure out what's the level that we can live with into a contingency phase, which probably develops into the new normal. In many cases, this pandemic, I think, is a good example. 9/11 was a good example. Contingency phase adjusted becomes the new normal. We never really go, this is part of the problem, I think, in resilience when we're talking to folks is trying to get them to look, we're never going back to that normal. This is going to affect the way we do everything going forward. So yeah, we got emergency, then we got contingency, but then we got to take that. So we're operating, but with some degradation. How do we make that, operate at that level, but with new measures, functions, and the like? So that's a pretty broad topic, but can you talk a little bit about, how you go through that, making the recognition and systems for that kind of thing, how you go through that phase in contingency ops, making that normal ops?
Here's where the engineer in me kicks in. This is where it's about God design and implementation. If you have an outcome that you desire, you have to have a way to measure your ability to achieve that outcome. And I don't care what the outcome is, whether it's a sort of a subjective outcome of equity and sense of belonging, which are hard to measure, but measurable, but hard to measure, or a very explicit outcome, water pressure, continuous water pressure for points of service across the water distribution system. That's a very explicit thing, which is important for sanitation, for not having contaminated water. Low water pressure means stuff gets into your water lines. So across all of those, you have indicators, things that you care about, and you have metrics, things that measure those indicators. And what you have to do is identify the metrics for your indicators, identify the indicators you care about. I said that the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities was died by 1,000 indicators. They had too many. Generally, people can manage what you can hold in your hand. We're kind of chimpanzees that way. If you can't carry more than 5 bananas, that's all you're going to have. So generally 5 to 10 indicators of what you can keep present in your mind. Now you can categorize those and expand it out with like an accordion by categorizing them. So within water, 5 things, within social equity, 5 things, but somehow we have to compartmentalize some of those things, understanding they're all cross-connected, but we have to have those things that we measure. And then you have to implement for effect. And if you're not causing things to get better, you're not doing your job. You're not succeeding. And so you have to measure them, which is called a benchmark the first time. And then you have to assess on some periodicity, usually annually at least. And in some cases, if it's a recovery program, daily or monthly, how well you're doing. Now we have an example of that right now, COVID-19 hospitalizations, cases, and deaths. I guess in hierarchy, it's cases, hospitalizations, and deaths, 3 hierarchies of metrics that we're measuring across the nation. Those are good examples of indicators and metrics of a thing we care about, the impact of this pandemic on our society. Others are homelessness and unemployment. Those are all complicated. If I say unemployment's a metric, I'm lying. Unemployment's an indicator. It's a thing we care about with 1,000 ways you can measure it. Homelessness is a thing we care about with 1,000 ways you can measure it. You have to define those ways for each of those and agree on them. And then you have to start measuring them. And then you'd better have a plan for making them better, or you're not an effective governance system. You just have to get better. That's the key. And so making it better is a continuous improvement process that is part of the social contract of governance. And so this is, goodness, in this political climate we live in, it's pretty clear. If you're not making it better, you're making it worse. That's that kind of framing. The same is not good enough. And so I want to make this, so that's all high-minded. The simple thing to do is you need to find the 5 or 6 things that matter most to your community that are going to determine their prosperity, because prosperity is the goal. Prosperity equals well-being, not wealth. Prosperity is the goal. What are the things that are challenging the prosperity of the community? Is it violence? Is it homelessness? Is it crime? Is it unemployment? Is it lead into drinking water? What are the 5 things that are most affecting the prosperity of your community? And work on those 5 things. After a tornado, what are the 5 things? The first things are triage, getting people medical care when they need it, right? The second thing is communications, so that you know who needs it and you can get to them. The third then is restoring power so that people can have lights and heat. And then you start water, right? So they can have electricity and water connected. And so you work down the list, those sort of triage strategies. But the challenge you were talking about is, how do you avoid recovering to this lower level? That's where you have to have a collective vision of what good is. What is the good life in Fayetteville, Arkansas? These are very local decisions. What is acceptable in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Little Rock, and not accepting less than. So you get hit by a tornado in Mayflower. What are you going to build back to? Now all the stone buildings and brick buildings are gone. So everybody goes back with steel buildings, with steel cladding. And so now it looks like a farm festival. You're driving through a farmyard when you go through town. That's one vision. The other vision would come back better and stronger with planning ordinances and policies that require build backs at a certain threshold that recover and in fact enhance the values of the community. I don't want to talk about how Mayflower went, but I can tell you what we tried to help them do. And they didn't do it because it cost more money. So what they went with was cheap. And guess what they're going to have? Next time the wind blows, you build your house on the sand.
And they had another come through. Well, and this is the other thing, is the concept. Mayflower is a great example. This is, we used to refer to it as the lightning doesn't strike twice theory in emergency management or resilience. And so the idea was, well, we'll build back the same because the chances are we won't have another. And they did have another. Not only did they have another tornado, on top of it, they had an oil leak that occurred at the same time with the pipeline. So they had, they were recovering from that one little community. And you know better than me, but my point is, it's and emergency planners are really bad about this, and people that are resilience planners, they get very monolithic. They look at this. I'm only going to have one emergency crisis at a time, because what's the chances it would happen, and then inevitably it does happen. So that's a difficult thing to sort through.
5 hurricanes have hit New Orleans or hit Louisiana this year. 5. Many of it's hard to keep a blue tarp on your roof from the last hurricane during the next hurricane.
Yep.
5 hurricanes in 1 year across the same sort of corridor, 300-mile wide, 250-mile wide corridor. I mean, it's the world we're living in is a hard world. The notion that this is easy is silly. It's lazy. This is hard. It's the hardest thing humans will ever do. And it's harder for us now than ever before, because things are changing faster and there are more of us. And the impacts of these things are greater. The impacts in terms of human tragedy. What that means is our responsibilities have never been greater. To whom much is given, much is expected, much is required. Much is required from us, because we have resources, assets, and prosperity never dreamt of in our grandfathers' wildest dreams. And so it's hard. Yes, it's hard. Of course it's hard. If it's not hard, you're just in the way. I kind of grew up in Oklahoma with this sort of, again, Cherokee and Mennonite cultural fusion. And the Cherokee fusion is very much about life is you enjoy every day because it's very likely your last. And the Mennonite notion is you get up at sunrise, you work your ass off all day, and you lay down at night, and you hope to wake up the next morning. And that's the best life can give you. Those are not bad framings for what we've got to deal with. This is hard work. We have to work ourselves hard, daylight to dark, and enjoying every day when we do it. Enjoy the work. And that's what I love about your class. I love the way you guys have put your things together here. I mean, it's been an honor to talk to you guys. I think you probably have other things you need. What time are we supposed to wrap up?
So we're just about at that time. I'll make a quick commentary. First off, to thank you, Marty, for that. I mean, it's fit perfectly into how we talk about the issues that you have with, the intersections of when you divide. It also points to this area. Had it not been for infrastructure, in particular, the infrastructure investment, Northwest Arkansas, Fortune 1 company making a decision for broadband, we would have seen, I think, a totally different situation with the ability of the supply chain to respond to demand. And so it fits right into urbanization and why that was important. Might have been accidental. It might have not been the plan, but
they were reacting to, I think they were reacting to a competitor. I don't think they envisioned their role. They were just trying to stay in the game. Turns out it became the only game in town.
Right. And it built resilience that there probably was some that said, hey, this will make it better for us to telework. And that's what we're going to talk about later tonight, is some of the plans with the pandemic for that. Marty, thank you very much. You as I suspected, provided some insights that are very useful to our students as they're trying to take this huge amount of information, assimilate it into a way to figure out, how do I build resilience in things? How do I become, a leader in my industry or government, wherever I am? And so it's been very useful for them to put in their toolbox. So thank you again very much.
Oh, it's my honor. Thank you all for your attention and your dedication to this issue. Let me know how I can help you in the future. And you guys enjoy the rest of your evening.
All right. Thank you again.